So I'm going to give you a really fast history lesson on homosexuality and mental health. I'm not going to give you the whole breakdown of what's happened around same-sex relationships and throughout the history of the universe, but let's just say that it's been a part of human experience since the very beginning. It's been found across all cultures and all locations. In the late 12th century, religious and secular hostility towards same-sex sexual behavior began to take root. What happened was a lot of more Christianity and some other religions began to sort of condemn it as a sin, as an aberration, and against natural law. They also had a lot of laws against any kind of non-procreative sexual acts. So some examples, like in the early American colonies, there were some of the stiff criminal penalties for sodomy, which is what they called sort of this umbrella term that encompassed a wide variety of sexual acts that were not procreative. One was homosexual behavior, obviously. Anything that occurred outside of the marriage was a problem. So sex between a man and a woman who are not married was also considered sodomy. And anything that violated traditions, such as sex between a husband and wife with the woman on top, were all considered crimes against nature. And it was all thrown into the same camp as homosexuality. Out of that, a lot of laws arose that criminalized these behaviors. And some of the consequences of that could be death, torture, institutionalization, things like that. Around like the 18th century, 19th century, to the 20th century, medicine came into play, and they started removing homosexuality from this idea of being sinful to being more of a pathology. Instead of being a crime that needed to be, somebody needed to be killed or tortured or jailed for long periods of time, that they considered it an innate pathology and that it needed to be treated. So this made a complete shift in how homosexuality was treated. So the term homosexual did not exist until 1869, when Richard von Krafft-Ebing coined the term, and it was it was popularized by him. It was coined by Carl Maria Kurtbeny, and he was a journalist who was interested in sexuality and wrote a lot about different kinds of things, and so he coined the term, and then it became popularized. And actually, Richard von Krafft-Ebing came up with heterosexual because he had to come up with something to counter homosexual. So actually, homosexual was developed first. Then in 1897, these are just sort of the important points, there was the Scientific Humanitarian Committee was started. And this committee produced the first sex research journal. So the person who was really behind that was Magnus Hirschfeld and a whole group of folks in Germany. This was all started in Berlin. And it was quite progressive, the kinds of stuff they were doing. People who came out of that, like Havelock Ellis, who in 1901 described homosexuality as inborn and not a pathology, were really trying to move people away from the idea that there was anything wrong with homosexuality. Magnus Hirschfeld was a homosexual as well, so he had some investment in that. But there were a lot of famous people who went through his clinic and did a lot of research in that area. So in 1905, we have Freud who comes in and says in his writings that people are innately bisexual and learn to be heterosexual and homosexual as a result of their environment. He did see it as a little bit of arrested development, but yet it was still considered, and he had written quite a few things for popular press stating that he was, that it shouldn't be a crime and it shouldn't be a sin, and it shouldn't be a pathology, it's just a normal variation. It occurs out of these particular things. So in 1919, Magnus Hirschfeld opens the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin, which followed the journal that they did. And in 1933, they had a library of information there. In 1933, that was destroyed by the Nazis. They came in and actually burned all of the materials that were in there. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that we no longer have access to as a result. Let's see. So move us forward to the 1940s. Psychoanalysts, several of them, decide that they reject Freud's theory and propose that homosexuality resulted from pathological family relations in the Oedipal stage. They went back to the arrested development idea and really felt like it was really severe pathology. And out of that notion and the continued idea of pathology in same-sex relationships or sexuality came a bunch of treatments for homosexuality. It started with medical treatments, which included hospitalizations, long-term, like mental institution hospitalizations, hormone treatments, lobotomies, things like that. So then the treatments that came out of the psychoanalyst camp was really to do a lot of psychoanalysis and, like 3 times a week of intensive therapy, processing all this stuff and trying to repair this arrested development. What has continued in what we call reparative therapies today, or you'll hear sexual orientation change efforts is a new term that's used, that the treatment of homosexuality has moved more into behavioral interventions. And this stuff started in the probably late 50s, early 60s with aversion therapies, where they would have somebody look at a picture of a homoerotic picture, and as soon as they had a feeling, got an erection or something like that, they would give them shock, electric shock, or something that induces nausea. So they would try and get them to have an aversion to what they were erotically charged by. Then they tried something called reduction of heterophobia. This is the idea that homosexuals are afraid of the opposite sex, and so if you just teach them systematic desensitization, that they'll get more comfortable with the opposite sex, and then they'll engage in sexual relationships with them. Then they moved into positive reconditioning, which is to induce sexual arousal while viewing or in proximity to the opposite sex. So they kind of did a pairing thing where they would get somebody aroused with something that was homoerotic, and then they would switch it to something that was more heterosexual and try and get them to pair their eroticism with that. And then there's social skills training, the need to learn skills for talking and relating to the opposite sex. One of the things to know about all of these interventions is that what's been found, the APA has found in a recent release after they're looking at all of these efforts that people are taking, because there's still a large community that believes that people can change their sexual orientation. What they found is that it's impossible to change one's sexual orientation. People can change their behavior if they really want to, or if, but they can't change their desire. And what they found is that there's a lot of negative effects as a result of these efforts to change people's sexual orientation, and it can be very traumatizing, and the rates of suicide go up. So it's a problematic thing. So then we move into, I kind of went forward, but we'll move back into the 1950s, and there's the Kinsey scale. Now, so a lot of you know about Alfred Kinsey. He was a sex researcher. And he developed this scale called the Heterosexual Homosexual Rating Scale, and it is a scale goes from 0 to 6. And what it showed, he basically did this study, started with males, American males, and he found that there were a large percentage of American males, and he found about 10% that had engaged in or identified as homosexual. Or had homosexual experiences. So he had this rating scale of 0 to 6, which, 0 would be exclusively heterosexual with no homosexual tendencies. 1 is predominantly heterosexual with only incidental homosexual tendencies. 2 is predominantly heterosexual but more than incidentally homosexual. 3 is equally heterosexual and homosexual, so this is the bisexual category. 4 is predominantly homosexual but more than incidentally heterosexual. 5 is predominantly homosexual, only incidentally heterosexual. And 6 is exclusively homosexual. So what you'll hear, some people will refer themselves as a Kinsey 6 or a Kinsey 4 or a Kinsey 5. That's what they're talking about. So it was a way of rating things. What we know now is that scale is actually not very accurate when we look at sexuality. So in 1957, Evelyn Hooker, who there's actually movies about Alfred Kinsey and Evelyn Hooker out there, she conducts an innovative study of a non-clinical sample of gay men. So it's important to know that all studies previous to that were done on clinical samples. So that it's kind of like if I go into an institution and I study people, then I'm going to find how everybody out there in this society acts, and that wouldn't work for anybody. But that's what they were doing, and so they were defining homosexuality based on the people who ended up in hospitals. When she looked at gay men who were not in treatment of any kind, who were just living their lives, she found no difference between heterosexual and homosexual men. In fact, she gave a set of projective tests, and what she found was that experts couldn't distinguish between respondents' sexual orientation at a level better than chance. And this study's been replicated with lesbian women, and they found the same result. Let's see. So what's happening now is that people are beginning to get angry, because one of the things to know about the gay community at this time was they lived in secret. They had communities that were in secret. They had secret codes with each other. They met in homes and in bars that were their own. And then when, at times, they would get raided by the police. And when they got raided, they would often have their picture and their names, their whole identity published in the newspaper. What this would result in is them losing their jobs, their families, all kinds of stuff. So in reaction to that, there started being in the 60s, where there was a lot of revolting about a lot of stuff, the transgender folks actually started revolting, because they were the biggest targets in many cases of the police. And the first known riot where transgender folks stood up to the police was called the Compton Cafeteria Riot, which happened in San Francisco in 1966. So it's the first recorded time that this happened. A few years later is the 1969 Stonewall riots, which happened in New York. And this is considered the birth of the LGBT civil rights movement. It started because there was a law on the books, and I think it was pretty much across the country, that it was against the law for somebody to wear more than 3 items of clothing, or they had to be wearing 3 items of clothing of their own gender. It's either one or the other. But if you were caught wearing clothing of the wrong gender, that you could be arrested. That it was actually a felony to do that. So what they did was they then would haul people off in paddy wagons. Well, the police raided the Stonewall bar, and there were several people there who were transgendered, who were wearing items of opposite sex clothing, and they were about ready to arrest them, and the whole bar rioted. And it started with some trans women who started throwing fits about this whole thing, and moved into this whole movement of people really standing up against what the laws and society was saying. So in the 1970s, there starts to be an attitude shift based on all of these things that are happening, shortly after the Stonewall riots, and people are getting louder, talking, challenging these ideas. And they started looking at the evidence that really was out there on research on gay men. And a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists began to alter their view of homosexuality. Now, up until this time, homosexuality had been in the Dsm, our Diagnostic Statistical Manual, as a mental illness. And in 1973, as a result of all of this research and activists really challenging this, homosexuality was removed from the DSM. Actually, I think it was the DSM-2 it was removed from. So in 1978, Fritz Klein another sex researcher, developed something called the Multidimensional Klein Sexual Orientation Grid, called the KSOG. It actually looks at sexual orientation in a much broader way. It looks at sexual attraction, sexual behavior, sexual fantasies, emotional preference, social preference, heterosexual or homosexual lifestyle, and self-identification. It asks people to rate themselves past, present, and what their ideal is. So it gives you a much broader view of people's sexuality and how they view themselves and how they live their lives. For variables A through E, which is sexual attraction, sexual behavior, sexual fantasies, emotional preference, social preference, you're asked to rate yourself on a 7-point scale of 1 being other sex only to 7 being same sex only. And it's kind of follows that Kinsey scale, only at 7 points. Actually, I guess that's the same. And then for variables F and G, which is more about how you identify and your lifestyle, it is 1 is heterosexual only and 7 is gay and lesbian only. So it's that kind of look at things. So it gives you a much broader sense of things. One of the things he concluded was that people generalize from their own experience and feelings to assume, often wrongly, that other people must experience their own sexual orientations the same way. He found that sexual orientations are too complex to be broken into simple, well-defined categories, that they're much more broad. So in 1980, when the Dsm Three comes out, due to backlash from people who really believed that homosexuality was a disorder, they put ego-dystonic homosexuality back in the DSM as for people who really had difficulty with their homosexuality, that there was a way to treat them. The problem with that is that a lot of people have difficulty with their homosexuality because of societal forces. So it's basically internalizing discrimination. In 1986, after a lot of discussion about that, it's removed from the DSM. But then they add a new category. The new category they add is gender identity disorder and transvestic fetishism. So they take it to a different level. Now, one of the things to know about gender identity disorder is that for kids, it basically means cross-dressing in any or being interested in play of the opposite sex, which means that almost every tomboy out there would be identified with gender identity disorder. It actually was a way of going back and diagnosing homosexuality, because a lot of kids who are gender nonconforming grow up to be gay or lesbian. So it was a way of stopping things in a different way. Right now there's an argument, because that is still in the DSM, about whether it should be removed or changed, because being transgendered is not considered by people in the transgender community to be a mental illness. So it's a fight that's going on at the moment with the upcoming DSM-5.